The wild plums were small and hard, their skin still more green than purple, clinging to a low-growing thicket at the bend where the creek road met the high trail. Clara Marsh pressed one between her fingers and felt it give, barely. She put it in her mouth anyway. The bitterness made her eyes water, but she chewed and swallowed and reached for another. It was Wednesday. She had been walking since Monday morning. The town of Sulphur Creek sat 11 miles behind her now, and what remained of her life there could be counted quickly. A father's grave on the eastern hill, a stack of unpaid notes at the land office, a landlord who had been patient for 3 months and was patient no longer. She had left before dawn, before he could come knocking again, her good wool coat folded over one arm and her mother's leather satchel in the other hand. The satchel held a change of dress, a hairbrush, a small Bible, and 43 cents. She was 22 years old. She was not afraid. She told herself that firmly, the way a person states a fact they intend to make true by repetition. The Montana sky above the Bitterroot Valley stretched enormous and pale, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and strangely clarified, as if the vastness stripped away everything that was not essential. The road she walked was little more than 2 wheel ruts pressed into the earth, running north through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine toward the high timber country where she had heard there was work. She had heard wrong, as it turned out. The logging camp at Miller Creek had closed out its season 2 weeks prior. The man at the feed store in Sulphur Creek had not known that when he mentioned it, he had meant well. Clara ate another plum, grimaced, and kept walking. She did not hear the horse until it was quite close. It came from behind her, moving at an easy walk, and she stepped to the side of the road without looking back, the way a person does when they have learned that drawing attention to themselves rarely improves a situation. She fixed her eyes on the trail ahead and walked steadily. The horse slowed, stopped. She kept walking. "Ma'am." The voice was unhurried, neither warm nor cold. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. Clara stopped. She turned. The man on the horse was perhaps 35, lean and long in the saddle, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes the particular gray of riverstone after rain. He wore a canvas work coat and a hat that had clearly seen several seasons of hard use. He was not looking at her the way some men did on empty roads. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a situation he is trying to accurately assess. His gaze moved to the wild plum thicket and to the faint stain on her fingers. He did not comment on it. "You're heading north," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara said. She kept her chin level. "There's nothing north of here for about 16 miles, except for the Callaway timber operation." He paused. "They run their own kitchen." "I know." She did not know what else to say, so she said nothing further. He looked at her for a long moment. He took off his hat, turned it in his hands once, and put it back on. He seemed to be conducting some private deliberation. "I'm Thomas Hale," he said. "I run the Hale Timber Company, 8 miles up the North Fork. We are not the Callaway operation." Something in the slight flatness with which he said the name suggested the distinction mattered to him. "I am heading back there now. I find myself in need of someone who can manage a cookhouse for 16 men through a winter cut." He paused again. "Can you run a camp kitchen?" Clara had grown up in the back of her mother's boarding house, had been stirring soups and slicing bread and hauling firewood since she was old enough to reach the stove. She had cooked for as many as 30 men during harvest seasons, managed a larder for months at a time, kept accounts in a ledger her father had taught her to use when she was 8 years old. "I can run it in my sleep," she said. Something moved in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the flicker of a man who has just received useful information. "Wage is $12 a month plus room and board," he said. "You'd have a private room off the back of the cookhouse. The men are rough, but they are not disrespectful. I see to that personally." He did not offer to let her ride. He simply turned his horse to the north and began to walk it at an easy pace, slow enough that she could keep alongside without difficulty. Clara Marsh picked up her satchel and her wool coat, and she fell into step. The camp revealed itself gradually through the trees, the smell of fresh-cut timber and pine resin arriving before the sight of the buildings. It was a serious operation, larger than she had expected. A long bunkhouse sat to the east, a barn and equipment sheds beyond it, and at the center of the clearing, built close to the creek for water access, the cookhouse. It was a low, square structure with a wide, covered porch and two tin chimneys that should, in theory, have been producing smoke at this hour. They were not. Thomas Hale dismounted at the barn without ceremony and handed his horse to a boy who appeared from the shadows. He walked toward the cookhouse, and Clara followed. He opened the door and stood aside. She walked in. It was not the worst kitchen she had ever seen. It was, however, a kitchen that had been managed by a sequence of men who viewed cooking as a punishment rather than a craft. The great iron range along the north wall was coated in a thick layer of grease that had gone past dark and into something approaching geological. The cutting boards were gray with age and rough use. The dry goods storage flour, cornmeal, dried beans had been left open to mice. A sour smell hung over everything, the smell of a space that had been producing food without once producing pride. Clara set her satchel down on the cleanest corner of the table. She turned to Thomas, who stood in the doorway watching her with that same steady assessment. "I'll need a full inventory of what's in the supply stores," she said. "I'll need lye soap, sand, and a good scrub brush. I'll need to know when your next supply wagon goes to Missoula." "Thursday," he said. "I'll have a list ready by tonight." He nodded once and left. He did not apologize for the state of the cookhouse. He did not explain how it had gotten this way. He simply absorbed her requirements and departed to address them. That, Clara thought, turning back to survey her new domain, was the behavior of a man who respected competence enough to get out of its way. She worked through what remained of the afternoon and into the early evening. The range came clean slowly, stubbornly, yielding its decades of neglect only to sustained effort and considerable quantities of lye soap. The floor was swept, then scrubbed. The storage bins were emptied, inspected, cleaned, and restocked with what could be salvaged. By the time the evening light had gone gray through the small windows, she had managed to produce a pot of bean soup from stores that were not hopeless, a pan of cornbread from flour that was still good in the bottom of the barrel, and strong black coffee. She rang the iron dinner bell outside the cookhouse door. The men came in wary. They had, she would learn later, eaten their way through 4 cooks in the previous 8 months. They sat at the long table with the expressions of men who have been disappointed often enough to insulate themselves against expectation. Then the bowls were filled. Then the bread was passed. Then the coffee was poured. The room changed, not loudly. It changed the way a room changes when cold air stops coming through a gap and a fire finally draws properly. The particular tension of men who are uncomfortable, who have been uncomfortable so long they have stopped noticing it, quietly departed. A man named Dix, vast and bearded and evidently the most senior of the crew, took a second piece of cornbread, looked at it, and then looked at Clara with an expression of profound sincerity. "Ma'am," he said gravely, "this is real food." There was laughter at the table. Clara said nothing, only refilled the coffee. Thomas Hale ate at the far end of the table, apart from the crew in the manner of a man who maintains a necessary professional distance. He ate everything on his plate, folded his hands, and looked at the room. Clara did not look at him, but she was aware of his gaze moving across the table, across the faces of his men, reading what he saw there. He said nothing to her that night, but in the morning, when she came into the cookhouse at 4:30 to begin breakfast, there was a new cast-iron skillet on the range, still wrapped in brown paper from the Missoula hardware store. No note, just the pan. She unwrapped it, seasoned it, and made eggs. The weeks that followed were carved out of work and cold air, and the rhythms of a logging camp pressing into the high timber before the hard winter arrived. The days were long and physical and deeply satisfying in the way that only very difficult, very necessary work can be. Clara rose before the dark lifted, spent the hours of morning feeding men who needed enormous quantities of food to sustain the brutal labor of felling trees on a Montana hillside, and spent the hours of afternoon baking and preparing and managing the stores and ledgers of the operation's food supply. She discovered, very good at this, better than she had known. Thomas Hale ran a disciplined operation. He expected precision and delivered it himself. She saw the same quality in the way he inspected timber, the way he ran the morning crew meeting, the way he kept his equipment. He was not a man who tolerated sloppiness in himself or others, but he also did not mistake sternness for cruelty. He corrected mistakes quietly and specifically. He credited good work without fanfare. He noticed things. That was what she observed, piece by piece. He noticed when the axe handles were dry and left a tin of linseed oil by the equipment shed. He noticed when the youngest hand, a boy named Edmund who couldn't have been more than 17, was struggling with the cold at night and quietly had a second blanket added to the bunkhouse supply. He noticed when the board on the cookhouse porch steps was beginning to split, and one morning it was repaired before she had stepped on it. He left a burlap sack of dried apples by her door with no explanation. She made a deep dish apple cake and served it at supper. He ate 2 pieces and said nothing. But the next morning there was a small crock of good cinnamon on the kitchen shelf, the kind that cost actual money in Missoula. Their conversations were brief and functional. He reported the crew's schedule so she could plan accordingly. She reported supply needs. They discussed, in the practical terms of a shared enterprise, the logistics of keeping 16 men fed in the backcountry through a Montana winter. Beneath this, something else was being constructed, carefully, without discussion, in the manner of people who are both too cautious and too honest to proceed any other way. Clara noticed that he was the last to leave the table each evening, though he ate no more slowly than the others. She noticed that when she was working late in the cookhouse, she often was. The accounting alone was enough to keep her occupied long past supper. She would sometimes look up and see the light still burning in the small office window across the clearing. 2 people awake in the dark while the camp slept. It was in the 5th week of the winter cut that the trouble arrived. He came on horseback, 2 of them, from the south, on a Friday afternoon when the camp had come in early due to an ice storm moving down from the peaks. Clara was in the cookhouse making bread when she heard them come into the yard and saw through the small window a man in a good coat and a hat that had not suffered weather dismount at the porch of the main office. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it was Garrett Pace, a timber broker out of Butte, who held a contract on 3,000 acres of standing timber adjacent to the Hale operation. She would also learn, by the time the afternoon was over, that he had been working quietly for several months to acquire the Hale parcel through a mechanism that was entirely legal and entirely predatory. Hale Timber was not in debt in the conventional sense. But Thomas had taken on a partner 2 years prior, a man named Fordham who had put capital into the expansion of the operation in exchange for a stake. Fordham, Clara would piece together from the conversation she could hear through the thin wall between the cookhouse and the main office, had been approached by Pace and had agreed to sell his stake. Pace now held 20% of Hale Timber, and he wanted the rest. The arrangement he was proposing was smooth and practiced, the kind of offer that has been designed to sound reasonable until you examine the underlying numbers. He would buy out the remaining stake at a valuation that he had calculated himself, based on a timber assessment conducted by an assessor who worked for the Butte Land Syndicate Pace represented. Thomas Hale's voice, when she heard it through the wall, was controlled. She knew what controlled sounded like on him now. It sounded exactly like the voice he used when something was wrong, but he had not yet determined what. She dried her hands on her apron. She looked at the wall. She thought. She had been managing the operation's supply ledgers for 5 weeks. She had, because she was thorough and because thoroughness was simply her nature, also been keeping a running notation in the margins of what she could see of the operation's productivity. The volume of timber moving to the mill, the contract price per 1,000 board feet, the pace of the cut, which had accelerated significantly since the cookhouse had begun producing food the crew actually wanted to eat, men, it turned out, working harder when they were not miserable. She opened the cookhouse's small storage closet and found the rolled survey map she had seen Thomas tack up on the wall during a planning conversation she had managed the coffee for 3 weeks prior. She spread it on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the supply ledger, turned to a fresh page, and began to write. She walked across the yard in the light snow that had begun to fall, stepped onto the office porch, and knocked twice. Thomas opened the door. His expression when he saw her was unreadable. Pace looked over his shoulder with the expression of a man who is accustomed to dismissing people who walk through doors without being invited. "I apologize for interrupting," Clara said. She was not apologizing. She stepped inside. Pace took her in the flour on her apron, the kitchen-worn hands, and turned back to Thomas with the particular dismissiveness of a man who has decided, in under a second, that the woman in the room is not relevant to his business. "Miss Marsh manages our operations records," Thomas said carefully. There was a question in his tone, directed at her. She answered it by opening the ledger on the corner of his desk. "The assessment your man conducted places the standing timber value on the north parcel at $60 per acre," she said, looking at Pace directly, her voice even and precise. "That is the Butte Syndicate's standard low-water assessment. They use it in every acquisition." She turned the ledger to face the room. "The current mill contract rate for this grade of timber is $11 per 1,000 board feet. The north parcel carries approximately 900 board feet per acre at the density shown on the survey." She tapped the map she had set beside the ledger. "At contracted rate, the actual yield value is closer to $99 per acre. The difference between those two numbers, multiplied by the 300 acres in question, is $11,700. The room was quiet except for the sound of snow beginning to come harder against the window. Pace's expression had not moved. Men like Pace were practiced at stillness. But something behind his eyes had shifted, a rapid recalculation. "The young lady has been doing arithmetic," he said, with the tolerant smile of a man preparing to explain why the arithmetic is wrong. "The young lady's arithmetic is correct," Thomas said. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest and most absolute she had ever heard him sound. He had been looking at the ledger while she spoke, and she knew he understood every figure on it. Pace looked at Thomas. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at the ledger again, with the expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting a particular kind of conversation and found instead a closed door. He left. He made a graceful exit, as men of his type always do, framing the departure as a choice rather than a retreat, suggesting they would revisit the conversation at a more convenient time. No one in the room believed him. When the sound of his horse had faded down the south trail, Thomas Hale stood at his desk for a long moment, looking at the ledger. He did not speak for so long that Clara wondered if she had overstepped, if the certainty she had felt had been a form of presumption. Then he looked at her. His eyes were the same riverstone gray, but the quality of stillness in them was different now. There was something open in it. "Where did you learn to read a timber survey?" he asked. "My father surveyed land for 20 years, she said. "I kept his records from the time I was 10. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when a piece of information settled into place for him. He looked at the numbers on the page again. $11,000, he said quietly. "And change," Clara said. He almost smiled. It transformed the geometry of his face. That almost smile made him look momentarily younger and considerably less armored. He picked up the ledger, looked at her careful figures, put it down. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something further and determining that the words available to him were not equal to what he wanted to say. "Thank you, Miss Marsh," he said finally. It was insufficient, and they both knew it. "You're welcome, Mr. Hale," she said, and she went back to her bread. That night the snow came in earnest, the first real storm of the season, blowing out of the northwest and turning the timber camp into an island. The crew was confined to bunkhouse and cookhouse, which suited Clara well enough. She kept the stove running through the evening, kept the coffee hot, produced an enormous pot of beef stew from stores she had been conserving for exactly this kind of storm-bound evening. The men played cards and told stories, and the cookhouse was full of warmth and the particular comfort of bad weather viewed from a safe position inside. Thomas came in late, after the men had settled, stamping snow from his boots at the door. He had been checking on the horses and the equipment, which was the kind of thing he did the last check. The extra round, the attention to everything before he permitted himself rest. She had a plate waiting on the warming shelf. He sat down at the near end of the long table, and she brought it to him, and a cup of coffee, and she sat down across from him because the hour was late, and the formality of the camp day had dissolved somewhat in the storm. They were quiet for a while. The wind pushed against the walls. The fire in the range ticked and settled. "Fordham is going to be a problem," he said after a time. He was not speaking to her in a confessional way. He was speaking to her the way he might speak to a partner, laying out a situation to think through together. "He can sell his stake to whoever he likes," Clara said. "But Pace can't compel a buyout of the rest unless the operation is in default." "Is it?" "No," Thomas said. "But Fordham may make things difficult regardless." He paused. "He has that nature. People with that nature," Clara said, "usually move on to easier opportunities when the current one resists." She looked at him. "The best thing you can do is make this operation visibly, obviously not in trouble, so that any pressure Fordham tries to bring looks like exactly what it is." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "You think like a businessman," he said. It was not a compliment of the conventional type. It was something more useful. It was recognition. "My father lost his land to a man with a ledger," she said. "I decided early that I would learn to read one." He was quiet at that. He looked at his hands on the table, the rough-knuckled, capable hands of a man who worked outdoors in difficult conditions. "I'm sorry about your father," he said finally. "He was a good man," she said. "He simply trusted that goodness was sufficient protection." She paused. "It isn't always." "No," Thomas agreed. "It isn't." The storm blew for 2 days. On the third morning, the sky cleared to a brilliant cold blue, and the world outside was rebuilt in white and silence and clean new shapes. Clara stood on the cookhouse porch with her coffee and looked at the timber climbing the hillside above the camp, the dark green of the pines heavy with snow, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt located. She felt that she was in a place that was hers, not by title, but by the investment of herself in it. She heard the door of the main office open and close. She heard his boots on the snow. He came and stood beside her, not close, but near enough to share the view. He did not speak right away. He rarely did, and she had stopped expecting him to fill silences with words. She had come to appreciate the honesty of his quiet. "The winter cut will run through March," he said at last. "After that, the permanent work here is smaller. Maintenance, contract management, breeding stock for next season." He paused. "I would not want you to feel that your position here depended on the size of the crew." Clara looked at the snow on the pines. "What I mean," he said, and his voice was careful and earnest in a way she had not quite heard before from him, "is that I would not want you to leave in March." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountain, his expression deliberate and serious. A man who is aware that he is saying something important and wants to say it correctly. "I am a straightforward man," he said, "and I am going to ask you a straightforward question, and you are entirely at liberty to answer it however you see fit." He turned from the mountain to her. "I would like you to stay, not as a cook, as my wife. If that is not what you want, I will make sure you have whatever you need to go wherever you choose to go, and I will say no more about it." He paused. "But I find that I cannot let the moment pass without asking." The cold air was clean and sharp. Somewhere up in the timber, a branch shed its load of snow with a soft, concussive thud. Clara looked at this man who had never once pitied her, who had handed her a difficult job and stepped out of her way, who had left a new skillet without a note and fixed the porch step before she asked, and listened to her arithmetic in a room full of male authority and had simply said, "She's right. You took 11 weeks, she said. Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. "I told you I was straightforward. I didn't say I was fast." She looked at him a moment longer, this slow, solid, decent man. "Yes, Mr. Hale," she said. "I'll stay." He exhaled. She watched the relief move through him, quiet and genuine, the way an emotion moves through a person who does not perform them. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she agreed. They were married in April, when the snow had pulled back from the lower meadows, and the aspens were beginning to come green. The ceremony was held in Sulphur Creek, the town she had walked out of with 43 cents and a borrowed hope, conducted by a circuit preacher who shook Thomas's hand afterward and told him he had excellent taste. The logging crew came in clean clothes, which cost each of them considerable effort, and was therefore the highest available compliment. Dix wore a suit jacket that had not seen daylight since some previous decade, and the expression on his face was one of solemn ceremony. Clara wore a dress of soft blue wool that she had made herself over 2 evenings of lamplight sewing, and she carried 3 stems of wild plum blossom cut from the thicket at the bend of the creek road where the story had started, in the small, unhurried way that certain stories start, with a woman alone and a bitter taste in her mouth and the stubborn, foolish decision not to stop. After the supper, which Clara had, of course, cooked herself, a feast that converted several men of the permanent crew to a lifelong belief in the institution of marriage, they stood together in the doorway of the cookhouse, which was also her kitchen and her office and her domain, watching the evening come down over the Bitterroot. Thomas took her hand. His fingers were warm. "When I found you on that road," he said, "I thought I was offering you something." "You were," she said. "I've come to understand," he said, looking at the mountains going dark against a sky still faintly gold, "that you were offering me something too." "I was," she said. "You just took a while to notice." "I noticed," he said quietly. "I noticed early. I was simply slow to be certain." "You were certain enough," she said, and leaned into his side. 6 years on, a visitor to the Hale timber operation above Sulphur Creek would find it considerably changed. The bunkhouse had been expanded. 2 new equipment sheds stood at the north end of the yard. The operation had added a mill contract with a railroad company out of Spokane, and the figures in the ledger that Clara kept in her neat, precise hand told the story of a company that had grown steadily and without the kind of risk that ruins a man's sleep. There was a girl of 4 named June, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's absolute refusal to be managed, and who could generally be found either attempting to climb the fence posts around the horse pen or sitting very seriously at the edge of the cookhouse table, studying whatever ledger her mother happened to have open. Thomas Hale watched his daughter examine a column of figures with an expression of pure concentration and felt something so large and quiet inside his chest that he could not have named it if pressed. "She's going to run the whole operation," Dix told him one afternoon from the doorway, watching June correct a number she had seen her mother write incorrectly and then go find her mother to point it out. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I expect she will." Clara appeared at the cookhouse door, wiping her hands, her dark hair catching the last of the afternoon light. She had the particular quality she had always had, even on the road that first day, of being entirely present in the place she was standing, of making the place she was standing feel more real. She looked at her daughter and at her husband, and the expression on her face was the most complete thing Thomas had ever seen. He thought of the road. He thought of a woman eating bitter plums and refusing to look beaten. He thought of the 17 different small moments in which she had shown him what she was made of before he had found the words to tell her what she had come to mean to him. He had been a slow man. He had arrived, in the end, exactly where he was supposed to be. Sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is refuse to let hard circumstances be the final word on who they are. Clara didn't wait to be rescued. She showed up. She worked. She paid attention. And in doing so, she quietly changed everything around her. Dignity isn't something given to you by better luck. It's something you carry with you down a long road and set down gently in the place where it belongs. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a little warmth and entertainment, and to leave behind one small, honest lesson worth keeping.